Pleasure to see everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the Eagleton Institute of Politics. For those of you who haven't heard, we're marking the Eagleton Institute's 50th anniversary this year, and we're employing our anniversary theme, Because Politics Matters. Tonight we underscore that message by highlighting an important new book about one of our state's most visible and certainly most respected political leaders. So I'm delighted. It's been a pleasure to see so many old and new friends of politics, of the Institute, and of Governor Kean here this evening. And the weather couldn't have been better for us, right? So we can even spill out of the tight quarters onto the porch. This event is a collaboration among several parties, and I'm going to say a few words about some of our partners. Eagleton, of course, but also, and very important, the Rutgers University Press, publisher of the book that is the focus this evening. Marley Wasserman, who is director of the Rutgers Press, unfortunately is out of town at a required professional meeting. This date was one that she very much wanted to attend, but it was impossible. So she sends regrets that she couldn't be here to celebrate with all of us. She has worked with Al Felzenberg for, I think, 5 years. 6 years. That book takes a long time to be born. They have been busy and, as she describes them, dramatic years. Certainly we might describe them that way, dramatic also for the country, for the state, for the author, and for the subject of the book. She describes the results as 5, and everyone who hasn't bought the book yet, listen, she says 550 riveting pages that speak both to the remarkable career of Governor Kean and the careful research of its author. She and the press are extremely proud, and we at Rutgers in general, extremely proud that the press has published this. The press is represented here tonight by, I haven't seen Marilyn Campbell. Is she here?
Yes, right there.
Marilyn, welcome and thank you, the pre-press director who worked closely with the author for many months. One of the new projects that we are undertaking here at the Eagleton Institute as we enter our second half century is called the Governor's Program. Under the leadership of my colleague Don Linke, we're looking at governors both nationally and in New Jersey, building on the Institute's long-standing program many of you are familiar with on state politics and government, and complementing Eagleton's highly regarded work over many decades now on state legislatures. In that connection, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome another former governor of New Jersey, not just in that connection, in any connection, who is attending this event, Governor Brendan Byrne, who is here with his wife, Ruthie Zinn Byrne. Governor.
Hey, bravo!
Great to have you here. Governors Byrne and Kean, as you all know, have developed a close bond over the years, appearing together on many occasions, and very important from our point of view, modeling a brand of bipartisan comedy and comedy and occasionally comedy that, if it could be bottled, would command a very high price in these days of bitter confrontational politics. It's something that New Jersey should be able to ship out to the nation. Over the last several weeks, as one of the first stages of our governor's program, we've welcomed many members of Governor Byrne's administration to Eagleton to record their memories and their reflections. We hope to do the same for Governor Kean before long. Our new program has been made possible in large measure by the funds raised by Governor Byrne and Ruthie Zinn Byrne, and I want to take a moment to thank them for starting us off so well. It has been a wonderful opportunity, and we hope you'll be proud of everything that we do. We're always honored to have Governor Kean in this building. It's a place that he's been kind enough to visit many, many times over the years. He is extremely generous with his time and comes to see and speak with our students every year. Most recently, this past year, he served as the Clifford Case Professor, meeting with students, faculty, and a very dedicated audience of the public. I say dedicated because in all the sessions of the Clifford Case Professorship, the one that was the big public speech happened to take place not on an evening like this, but on an evening when the people who wanted to hear Governor Kean had to battle their way through a driving rain, deep puddles, but they came to hear him speak. And as usual, of course, it was more than worthwhile for them to have made that journey. He's here tonight not to give a speech this time, but to engage in a conversation with his biographer, Al Felzenberg. As he has put it, this evening, he meaning Al Felzenberg, Al will play the role of Charlie Rose. Charlie Rose is back on TV and healthy, I'm glad to say. I understand that to mean that Al will artfully elicit some new insights from his subject. But first I want to shine the spotlight on the author himself for a moment. He too has a long history in this room. Al Felzenberg was an Eagleton Fellow in the class of 1972. Since that time, he's earned a PhD in politics from Princeton University and built a reputation as a presidential historian. He co-authored Evolution of the Modern Presidency, a bibliographical survey. He directed the Heritage Foundation's Mandate 2000 project on the presidential transition process and edited Keys to a Successful Presidency, which is a guide to the last presidential transition. In the 1990s, Al held several senior staff positions in the House of Representatives. He's also served in 2 presidential administrations, most recently as a consultant to the Secretary of the Navy and as Director of Outreach in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Al's history with Governor Kean goes back, I was going to say to the 1980s. He corrected me earlier today and said, no, it's before that, he'll tell you, back to the 1960s. But in the 1980s, he served as New Jersey's Assistant Secretary of State in the Kean administration. More recently, he's been principal spokesman for the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States, the 9/11 Commission, and for its nonprofit successor organization, the 9/11 Public Discourse Project. He's been a guest commentator on all of the major television networks, and his writings have appeared in the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, Philadelphia Inquirer, Christian Science Monitor, Weekly Standard, and other publications. He's just completed a fellowship at the Kennedy School of Government in Boston, where he taught a course on bipartisanship in a polarized political atmosphere. That's a topic about which he undoubtedly learned a great deal from Governor Kean. Al has taken on a most challenging task, writing a biography of a living person whom he knows well. Marley Wasserman, the director, as I mentioned before, of the Rutgers University Press, and a very tough critic, reports that he has done a terrific job. But I'd like to tell all of you that you can judge for yourselves this evening by purchasing an autographed copy of the book before you leave here tonight. It will continue to be on sale after the conversation between them. For now, with many thanks to both of our guests, I'll turn the floor over to Al Felzenberg to begin the conversation.
Thank you, Ruth. I'll be very brief before we start. I say in the first line in the book that the book, like its subject, has a long history. Can you hear me? I say in the first line that the book, like its subject, has a long history. You heard that it took 6 years to do, but it actually began at Eagleton. It actually began in the room next door. So if you don't like anything in the book, blame Alan Rosenthal, standing right outside. Alan gave a great class on the legislative process and assigned some fascinating books on the state legislators, what they do. I had never thought much about state politics before. I was interested in Congress, I was interested in the presidency. But I've been active in government, active in politics, and I said, gee, we're so close to Trenton from New Brunswick. Why don't I go down there every now and then and see what this fellow that I helped elect was doing in between elections? And I found it was a fascinating place, Trenton at that time. And I'd always had the idea in my mind, but we had the opportunity to do this, and I'm very grateful for that. I look around this room with a little trepidation because almost everybody here is in the book. So, in one way or another, and Tom and I were talking about who's going to play who in the movie, and I'll just tell you one story about this. Tom called the other day about something else relating to the commission, and he said, "Well, what's going on with the book?" And I said, "I was just talking to a Hollywood agent," and he said, "What about?" And I said, "Robert Wagner wants to play you." And he said, "He's dead." And I said, "Not the mayor of New York, Tom. The actor was married to Natalie Wood." And he said, "Well, Mayor Wagner was married to Natalie Wood." So I said, "Well, maybe we should talk about some other things." But I want to say a few things. The book, like Gall and other things, I think of them in three sections. The early parts really deal with the New Jersey legislature, the time that I really met Tom and saw him campaigning and went down to observe him. Now, Tom was elected in 1967. I'm just going to give you a little bit of the color of the era. That was the first legislature elected after the court rulings that mandated that, as Earl Warren put it, they represent people and not trees. The one man, one vote principle. It was a very volatile time in American history. Tom and his running mate, Phil Kaltenbacher, were elected 3 months after the Newark riots. Those riots shaped a lot that was going on. The aftermath of the riots shaped a great deal of what was going on in New Jersey history for the next several decades. Because people, rather than trees, were beginning to assert themselves, you've had a lot of revolutions taking place. You had the Civil Rights Revolution making its demands. You had the environmental movement coming into its age. The consumer rights groups were pushing demands. The women's movement was taking shape. So it was a period of great change in New Jersey history. And Marley said, I have good news and bad news. Marley said she would give me all this space because no one's really written up that legislative history. Now the good news, you heard about 546 pages, 100 are notes. So I just shaved some of the reading assignment for it. The second reason, we in New Jersey pride ourselves on having a very, very strong governor institutionally, but we've also had some very strong men in that job, and one woman in that job since the 1946-47 Constitution. George Will calls the office the Caesar of American politics because, as you know, they appoint all the judges and all the prosecutors and most of the all the cabinet, or most of the cabinet, and it's the one elected official. And I thought, well, this is really worth a look. There hasn't been very much done, and the things that I have seen of past biographies were governors who served before the 47 Constitution. Governor Edge wrote a memoir. There's a biography of Governor Edison around, and of course, Woodrow Wilson's got a biography because he had figured out a faster way to get to Trenton than his predecessors and his successors did. But there really wasn't anything, and I thought, a good opportunity now to see how governors interact with the rest of the state under that Constitution would be an interesting look, and also how they interact with the federal players on the stage. You see several presidents dancing across these pages. And finally, the commission. And I won't say much about that. We'll talk about this when the conversation begins. But I will say the indelible imprint of the commission, I think, is not only what it succeeded, but the way that it succeeded. And the fact that it was bipartisan. And that is really our logo, really our stamp, really the first thing that comes to mind. Tom Kean and Lee Hamilton together on television. As you read these pages, only the 400 now, you'll see that there was somebody in almost every chapter of Tom Kean's career who played that Lee Hamilton role, and that this style was emerging throughout the previous six decades. When Tom was in the legislature, sometimes it was in the person of the governor. At that time it was Richard Hughes. Sometimes will be in the presence of another legislator, the young Robert Valence, who had preceded Tom in the Education Committee. But there's always a Democrat around to help Tom steer what I call a third way between the two extremes of both ends. And of course, as governor, we can talk about that a lot, and we probably will. But on the national stage, when Tom was active in the National Governors Association and many other things, another governor would always appear in the form of a Bruce Babbitt or a Mario Cuomo or a young fellow from Arkansas named Bill Clinton, with whom Tom would do some of the same kinds of public roles that you saw him play with Lee Hamilton. Last point, it all started in a place called Irvington, which was a Democratic town in what was supposedly a safe Republican district. And to get elected, I think you had to figure this out. And I want to pay tribute to the one person in this room I think I know longer than Tom Kean, Stuart Hausman, who was elected to the Freeholder Board the year before Tom was elected to the Assembly, and showed Tom a lot of the ropes when he came. I also want to acknowledge three legislative leaders who haven't been acknowledged yet. Former Senate President McDermott, former Senate President Bennett, and current leader Leonard Lance of the Republican minority. And with that, I never compare myself to Charlie Rose, but I'm going to give it a go. So let's see. Thank you, Ruth. And thank Rutgers Press and Tony Ciccatello, who was very helpful in putting this together tonight, Matt Barnes, and Heather Grizzle, who I can't see, but I'm sure she's outside, and Alan Rosenthal for starting this thing off. Well, Governor, I think the first question I probably should ask you is, I tried to give a sense of the tenor of the times, but what was that legislature like in 1967? You had, what, 3-to-1 Republican majority replacing a Democratic 2-to-1 majority, and there you were.
It was unusual. By the way, this is unusual, too. I think most people who are in this position are dead. But talking to your own biographer is interesting. But I will say that that legislature in 1967 was really remarkable in a number of ways. First of all, most of us were totally inexperienced because there had been a Democratic legislature who had been in Trenton for a while under Dick Hughes, and a lot of senior people. And that year, because of a couple of issues before the public, the thing turned totally. So it was a Democratic legislature that became an overwhelmingly Republican legislature, but very little old leadership. And the first thing we did was what you did in those days, is allow the county chairman to pick the leadership. But once that had been done, a number of us decided never again. It was not a good group, and by and large. But it was a bunch of young Turks. I mean, people who weren't experienced, very bright. It was before some of the reforms which now keep good people out of the legislature. And I'll tell you my pet peeve. We passed a bill, it's a bill I regret most voting for, I think, in all my time, 10 years in the legislature. I think you signed it. But it was a bill, ethical reform, but one of the parts of that bill was, it said that if your law firm, if you were a lawyer and your law firm did business before the state, that you could not serve in the legislature. Now, we used to have a number of brilliant young lawyers who served in the top law firms in the state. A number of them had to resign, Robert Valence being one of them, when that bill passed, after he voted for it and he resigned. But a number of others. And since then, if you work for a large law firm in the state, obviously the law firm does business before state government, so all those young lawyers, all those brilliant young lawyers are excluded from serving in the state legislature. Well, that was before that law, so we had a bunch of these young lawyers and a bunch of young Turks. It was an exciting place. It was exciting because we were new. We didn't know very much, but we were all idealistic on some subject or other. We got to know each other, and as Al said, the time was interesting. I mean, between the riots and the movements and everything else, it was an exciting time to be in the legislature with an exciting group of people, Republicans and Democrats.
Well, your first year was 1968, that volatile year in American history. I think you were a legislator for 2 months, and Lyndon Johnson decided not to run again. A month later, Martin Luther King is assassinated, Bobby Kennedy is assassinated, and all kinds of student demonstrations are erupting. You're kind of in the middle of that with a bill that we finally referred to as the Kean bill, but then it was known as the EOF. And can you tell us a little bit about its evolution?
Well, it was. This was something that I was thrust into leadership in a sense because there wasn't anybody else. Our young Turks decided, that we were going to put one of our number into the leadership, even though the county chairman at the time didn't want it, and they selected me to sort of represent the young. So I was first into a committee chairmanship and then into leadership. In those days, if you became assistant majority leader, 2 years later you were speaker. Nobody served more than 1 year, so you moved right up. So I got into leadership, I guess, my second or third year in the legislature, and which was unusual because there wasn't that many other people who had experience. But that was a bill that, because I'd come out of education, that was before I was a politician, I was an educator, and because we were very sensitized in those days on the problems that really had caused the riots, one of them being that a lot of young people in our cities had no opportunity to get decent jobs and to have much of a chance. I wanted to put in a bill that would give people who didn't have an education, simply because they didn't have money, no other reason, they were able enough, a chance to get one. And I got part of the idea from talking to a fellow called Harry Smith, who some of you may remember, who became president of Essex County College. He said the one thing we need is there are a lot of people out there who could come here and don't have the money. I then started to put in a bill, and Ralph Dungan, who was Governor Hughes's higher education commissioner, chancellor, I guess, asked to see me. And he said, I'm putting in a bill because a lot of these people you're talking about are getting into college, but because the schools are so lousy in the places they come from, they're not prepared, and they stay half the freshman year, and then they have to leave because they're not prepared enough to do college work. So he said, I was putting in a bill to give the colleges the incentive and giving them some money so that they could give these kids extra help to catch up with what they didn't get in school. So we ended up combining the two bills into what became the Education Opportunity Fund. Probably, my years as governor and legislator, probably the bill I'm most proud of all the time, but we became the state's largest scholarship program. I suggested to somebody, if somebody's looking for a PhD thesis, the evolution of that bill and what's happened to those particular people who benefited from it would make a wonderful study. Because if you give kids, I'll tell you from Drew, where I was president, you would find these kids, let's say the average SATs at Drew was 1270 to 1300 or something. We would take kids, as every college in the state does, and university, we would take kids with SATs sometimes in 10-something, sometimes 9-something. In other words, really not qualified on the basis of tests. We'd take them into the EOF program. We'd have them there in the summer to get prepared. We'd mentor them, and there was one mentor for each student. There was only about 4 mentors on campus, so they really got concentrated on. Any problems, that person was there for them. We carried it through all 4 years. We funded it, Drew, for the other 2 ourselves. But the result is that every single year there was a significant portion of those people who wouldn't otherwise have had a chance who graduated with honors and went on with full scholarships to graduate school. I remember the year Hillary Clinton came and gave our graduation speech. The graduation speaker was one of these kids. He was going on to a full scholarship in psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania. And if you compared him, and then his family came, and Hillary commented, because that family, you could tell by their dress, his brothers and sisters, by the way they spoke, by everything else, that those kids didn't have a chance of really advancing in this world. And that kid, because he had been given opportunity and given some help, even though he wasn't in good shape after high school, was going on to a great career. And it gave me belief that None of these kids are lost, even after they've had bad high school experiences. But that, Al, I'm going to talk too long, but I mean, that bill I'm very, very proud of, and I think I went to the 25th anniversary, and there were members of Assistant Secretary and the President's Cabinet, there were 5 or 6 mayors, there were lawyers, there were teachers, there were just, and they all said without that fund, we couldn't have been who we are. And so that's, I'm sorry to talk so long.
No.
But that's one I'm very proud of.
I want to follow up on that because I talked a little bit about student demonstrations in that era. And Rutgers was, of course, not free of them. And a lot of them also had a racial overtone. You remember, perhaps, a group of minority students at the newer campus took over a building. Happened in New Brunswick as well. They were pressing for greater members of their community to come to college. And they made very forceful demands. And you came up to the campus one time, and I called this section the camp counselor and the student radicals, because you were not that much older than they were. You were in your early 30s. You had been a teacher before. You had been a camp counselor with many, many hard cases, children of similar backgrounds. And the dean did not want you to go in there. So can you pick the story up there and tell me what that was about and what went on in that room?
Well, that was sort of fun because people, the riots hadn't been that long ago, and people were still a little bit scared. I mean, people in the suburbs were scared. They thought somehow that, you went into the Newark, you're going to get hurt somehow, and that people whose skin happened to be a different color were dangerous, and therefore you should stay away. And this interesting thing to me was, you had some wonderful people at the university in those days, from the president on some of the deans, but they had no conception at all how to talk to people who came from a totally different background, happened to be a different color. And they had some liberal theories on how to do it. But it just didn't work. And the kids thought that was phony. And so you had these confrontations where the kids were occupying buildings, confronting administrators. So the administrators were trying to do some psychotic dialogue, which wasn't working for them. And at this point, I think these kids had occupied something at Rutgers, and they were all in this room. And I was chairman.
Conklin Hall, the main building.
Well, I was chairman of the education committee, so I said, I'm going to see them myself, because everybody said don't. The state police on. I said, hell with it, So I went down, and went into the kids didn't trust anybody, particularly a legislator with a white skin. So they had demanded that somebody record the meeting. And so the dean or the president or somebody had sent this kid with a tape recorder to do it. And I went in, and we talked about 5 or 6 minutes, and everything lowered. And everybody started talking with each other, and the head of the group turned to the kid with the microphone and said, we like this guy, we don't need you, get out of here. And the funny thing was that kid, because he'd been told by the president to record the meeting, now he's being thrown out of the room, he went outside, put one of these suction things to the wall, and put his microphone up. So somewhere I still have a tape, but you can faintly hear the discussion that we had in that room. But the bottom line was they were right. They were right that the kids in the Newark campus were not being given quite the same treatment as, frankly, as kids on the New Brunswick campus. They were absolutely right that minorities were not being given the same crack in admissions and weren't being recruited the way they could to diversify the campus. And the more I talked to them, the more I thought, you've got a lot to say here, and we better listen. But out of that came legislative hearings. Out of that came, I think, some changes at the university, and maybe even changes in the higher education system at the state. And it was taught me what I already knew, that you're going to talk to people, and you sometimes find out things you don't read in the press about them.
I mentioned the environmental movement was in its infancy then. We tended to think progress is good, no matter what kind of progress, what kind of building. You got involved in something that Governor Byrne then got involved in as well. Remember the Tox Island Dam? But it started with a place called Sunfish Pond. And how did you get involved in this? And you once told me it was like you kept pulling on this thread, and this little thread brought down the mountain. So can you tell me a little about this?
Yeah, it was sort of funny, because as Governor Byrne remembers, the Tux Island project, which was going to be a huge lake and dam and everything, taking up the whole part of the upper Delaware and flooding a good part of a couple of counties, I guess. It was a huge project. Yeah. And was going to use to be pump storage and electric power and going to be a huge recreation area and everything else. Was for a while an article of faith. I mean, I think Governor Minor certainly was strongly behind it. I think Governor Hughes may have been behind it. Frank Thompson was a really, and his brother, who ran the Delaware Port Authority, was very much behind it. And Dawes Thompson, I think his name was. And he was very much behind it. Labor unions were backing it as they would. Chamber of Commerce backed it, and it was generally, thing was moving along. And one of the things they were going to do is take Sunfish Pond, that some of you may have visited. I don't know. It's a wonderful walk up in Sussex County. If you want to ever do it, it's on the Kittatinny Ridge by the New Jersey section of the Appalachian Trail. And take this Sunfish Pond and turn it into the upper part of a pump storage system, great electricity. I went up to see it under the invitation of a guy called Casey Kays, who was a wonderful guy, who was just a factory worker. But he said to me once, he said, as far as I'm concerned, the reason I'm so for these state parks is I'm poor. I don't have a backyard. The state parks are my backyard. And it was one of the more articulate expressions I've ever heard of why the environment and conservation become so important. But Casey took me up there. Look at it. One of the last glacial lakes in the state, still fully preserved. Beautiful place in the Appalachian Trail. And I decided this is not going to be destroyed. So I sort of went to war on it. And the public service company owned the lake, and it was Jersey Central Power and Light when the two of them were developing this thing. I put in a bill in the legislature to condemn it back. They thought that I was kidding, or that it was just for show, until I got the bill moving, at which point they turned every lobbyist loose on me. I think there was an old, you may remember him as a wonderful old Irishman. He used to lobby for public service for years. Remember his name, but he was a nice guy, but just couldn't understand what I was doing. First he thought I was a traitor because my brother was in the utility business. And he said, have you talked to your brother about this? And I said, we don't agree on everything. And then I remember going in, I think Al has this in the book, I remember going into some sort of a meeting in Essex County or something, a political thing, and I was walking in, I had my hands sort of bandaged because I'd been stung by a bee, and I walked in and I heard him whisper to the guy next to him as they went by, not close enough to the heart. But this became a real battle in which we took on the labor unions, the chamber, and everything else. And I got to the point, because I was elected to leadership in the assembly, I could get the bill through the assembly. And then they'd block it in the Senate. So then I'd put it in again. We'd get through the assembly again and be blocked in the Senate. But as we started looking at this, it turned out that not only, in my mind, Sunfish Pond that should be preserved, but the whole Tux Island project, which was supported by governors at that point of 4 states, was questionable, because it really wasn't going to do the kind of things that people suggested it would do. And there were many, many reasons against the thing, not just that you'd destroy some of the best and most beautiful land, as you've been up there in Sussex County and that part of New Jersey. And so we battled it. More and more people sort of joined the war. And the big guy who had been supporting it, to make it a long story short, was Nelson Rockefeller. And some of our scientists found out the fact that as you created this giant, huge lake from the Delaware, that because of the farms up in the upper reaches of the Delaware in New York State and the runoff of fertilizer from those farms, the pond would call what you call eutrify. Eutrophication would occur. In other words, the thing would become an open, nothing would grow there. Become a big scum-covered thing. And so we pointed this out, and nobody paid attention except when people said, well, we can fix that. We'll just regulate the farms in upstate New York so they can't use the fertilizer. All of a sudden, Rockefeller disappeared as a supporter. And after that, it just, as Al said, just unraveled like a ball of spring. We're not only able to finally save Sunfish Pond, but we're able to stop the whole Tux Island project, which has been supported by Congress, by 3 states, by 4 states, by whatever. And it was nice. Go visit Sunfish Pond. It's a beautiful place still.
I think that was one of the first decisions Governor Byrne had to make, because Governor Cahill had vetoed the project at the end, and then the Army Corps, if I remember, tried to get it opened again. Wasn't that one of the first things on your list?
It's his night.
Okay.
I have a little different version of it.
There's a method to the question.
Yeah.
We'll have our book.
All right. Before I move on, I'm going to do it again. The New York Times ran a story when Governor Byrne addressed the first meeting of the Port Authority, and Governor Rockefeller, I think, was the senior governor in the country. And there was a comment to the governor, Governor Rockefeller, "You've seen New Jersey governors come and go." And he grabbed the mic and said, "Nice guys, all of them," you know. But to be governor, you have to go through a campaign. And that 81 campaign is remembered as one of the most exciting and one of the closest in New Jersey history. Those of us, the younger people here who lived through Florida, remember the older people here lived through New Jersey. Now, if you look at the New Jersey Legislative Manual, it does say that that was the most studied and most counted election of any polity its size in American history. At least that's what they say in the Legislative Manual. Tell me about that. How does a candidate think that the primary is now over, the general election is now over? Normally, you get a result, and here we have to keep going. Mm-hmm. And what do you do in those situations? What do you think of?
Well, that's you don't think, you feel in that kind of a situation. But the interesting thing that's different in the state of New Jersey than it would be in other states. You remember the presidential business in Florida with the court, which had been appointed by Democrats siding with the Democrats, the legislature, I guess, Republican, or the governor certainly Republican, the Secretary of State who's supposed to be in charge, Republican. Everybody seemed to be making decisions based on what their political party was, which is one of the huge problems that occurred in that state. New Jersey, this election, we had the same stuff. We had chards, and we had hanging this, and we had all those kind of ballots in those
Paper
situations.
ballots.
But the difference in New Jersey is that the government doesn't operate that way, and particularly our good governors don't operate that way. So when the recount came, other than the fact we sent a lot of lawyers to Jersey City and Camden election night, other than that, I had no doubt whatsoever that under basically the governor's supervision that the thing would be done fairly. And there was never a question. It was not a worry about who was a Democrat and who was a Republican. The governor put a professional, Mike Cole, in charge. Nobody knew what party Mike belonged to at that point. I don't know what party he did belong to at that point, but he was put in charge. And whoever won, I think both Jim Florio and myself knew that the count would be fair. So nobody was going to challenge it in court. Nobody was going to yell that it was being done on partisan grounds. And it's a tribute not only to Governor Byrne and his administration, but I think that's the way New Jersey works. The Attorney General's office, by tradition, is not a particularly partisan office. They hire lawyers from both parties. I hope they still hire lawyers from both parties, like you and I did. And therefore you trust the results. And that was so that was a big difference. And you're worried every day, because what happens in a recount is every day they make a few changes. And one day you lose 20 votes, another day you gain 20 votes. And most recounts come out about the same, because there may be 5,000 votes that are changed, which, goes about 2,500 each. I mean, it's in that area, and this is what happened in this one. But that it was a very, very nervous time for the family. And then, of course, the worry was that since I was leading from election night, I guess, on by a few votes, the worry was that every day that went by was less time to hire a cabinet and to get going with the business of the state. And yet, if you started to do it too early, you were being presumptuous. And you didn't want to do that, because so we sat out there until I guess the recount was over, and Jim I don't know if he conceded at that point, but everybody in the staff said, "You got to go see your governor." So I went down to Trenton to press conference and said, "I'm governor," and Jim conceded, and we never had any further challenges. The reason we never had any further challenges was just the system that people I think, and both of us were just absolutely aware it was done fairly.
When you win after such an arduous experience like that, and you come out of the recount, and you're ahead by, I think it was 1,757 votes, if I'm right. And you see you're facing two hostile houses in the legislature, hostile meaning the other party, and the first governor to come in without either house in his party's control in a long, long time. And you see the voters send a message, well, you kind of get through, and your party doesn't get through in the legislature. Did that change your thinking as you were planning your inaugural and your eventual budget and some other things that you had to do, or did you just forge on with what you wanted to do?
Well, as a legislator, obviously I'd been legislator longer in government than anything else. I've been at 10 years, and I had a lot of friends in both parties, and that was a help. And I honestly expected that we would be able to work together, the two parties, to get whatever was necessary. And we were when I got elected, we were in the middle of the worst recession since the Great Depression. So we had a budget deficit of, I don't know, close to $1 billion, I guess, eventually. And that was a lot of money in those days. That was funnily enough, it was not, it was a little less, but not if you put all the factors in, it was not terribly different from the one we have now. It was not that much less in terms of real dollars. So I thought we'd work together on it. And I think the Senate was sort of ready to do that. The Assembly got very partisan, which I didn't expect. And so we had some interesting days as they really, I think they took the attitude initially that this was a governor who had been elected by so few votes, that it was really going to be you shouldn't let him have his way. And I think they opposed everything. I said at one point, if I put in a bill to celebrate our mothers, they would oppose it. I think the first 6 months or so they did that. I mean, I think they opposed anything that we did. But in the process, I think we were able to put together some coalitions, which eventually were able to carry some legislation through. But the first 6 months, as Lou Thurston remember, those were tough months. Those were tough months for us. We had to really work to get anything done.
Now, one of the hallmarks of your administration was education reform. I counted them up. I think we had 24 series of reforms you passed. This was in the aftermath of President Reagan's study in A Nation at Risk. My question for you is, we seem to keep going back to the same issues. Maybe we've learned more now, but I was reading again. We've had more and more reform in the last 30 years in many, many states. And now we have the President's program, No Child Left Behind. When do you think we're going to get this right, and when do you think we're going to keep it right?
Well, I'll tell you the difference, I think, than when Brendan and I were governor and now. We were trying a lot of different things. You increased spending dramatically for the schools. I put in a number of changes which seemed to make sense to me at the time. Some of them were tough to get through the legislature. We got most of them through, everything from alternate route to certification to school takeovers and all of that. I think there were close to 30 different reforms. But I didn't really know what I was doing. It was things that made sense to me. Based on my experience in schools and my experience in education, I thought these things should be done because we recognized that A Nation at Risk had been written, that American schools were not competing with the rest of the world, that schools in our cities were warehousing our kids in most cases instead of educating them, and something had to be done. So we were trying one thing after another. The difference today is that we know what to do. The research has been done by a lot of people, and there's basic agreement. In the cities or with poor schools, you basically got to start with early childhood education. There's 3 or 4, we know that. We know that you got to educate principals better than they're educated now. You just can't put them in jobs, as we always have. You got to educate them and train them, and they should come from the proper backgrounds because they're the school leaders, and when you got a great principal, is your only chance of having a great school. We know that you've got to educate teachers better than we're educating in the state of this country. We've got to train them better. We know we've got to support them in the schools when they're there. And I can go on, but we know you've got to recognize great teachers. That means sometimes differentiating between teachers, which is something the union has never agreed to do, but everybody believes it would improve education. We'll be able to do that. So there are all these things that have been experimented with, and we know they work. We're not doing them. And that's the difference. We didn't know what we were doing, but we were trying stuff. Now we know what to do, and we're not doing it. And that's a crime, given the fact the kids are being hurt by not doing it. I'll say my one regret in education reform is one time I listened to the lawyers. Ed McGlynn knows I never like to do that. And this was on school takeover. We got so frustrated with some of the school districts that year after year were getting more money, and year after year their test scores were going down, not up, and the kids were not being educated. That it was really legislative violence, and I decided you had to take over some of these schools and see whether anybody couldn't run them better than they were running, and whether we couldn't do a better job by putting professionals in the schools. I wanted just to move in and sort of take them over. My lawyers, my attorney general, my chief counsel, everybody said, you can't do that. You got to get a bill through the legislature, or they'll be challenged forever in the courts. And I said, okay, you listen to the people who you trust, and I listened to them. And so we went through a battle of 2 to 3 years. It was challenged anyway in the courts for a year. But we went to a 2-year battle in the legislature. We made certain compromises in which we were not allowed to do the complete job. We were able to take it over, but not certain parts of it. And it wasn't entirely what I wanted to do. But we finally got the bill through, but as Al points out, I think in his book, the bill had flaws, and we had to make compromises to get it through the legislature. But we did it. But when we went to administer it, we couldn't do any. We could change the principals and the school board, but we couldn't do anything with the teachers. You couldn't do anything with the structure of the school. You couldn't do anything in a number of areas that you really know you have to do in order to change education for children. I got out of office, and I said, I won't mention who it is, but to somebody who had served in the Supreme Court at the time, I said, I thought I could do that under the thorough and efficient clause. I said, if you guys can threaten to close down schools under the thorough and efficient clause, I damn well could take over a few that obviously weren't doing their job, and I didn't do it because you and your lawyers wouldn't have accepted it. And he said, we would have welcomed it. He said, if you had done that unilaterally, he said, I think the court would have stood up and applauded. That's the regret I had. I mean, I think I would have been called arrogant, and I would have been called everything else, but I would have loved to just take over those schools, and then you could really have transformed them into model schools, I believe.
I want to ask one more thing about the governorship before we move on to the national situation that you and I know a lot. We had a lot of environmental crises when you were governor. We had dioxin issues, we had radon scares, we had issues in Sussex County and Jackson Township with groundwater and many, many other things. Ocean dumping, the beaches closed for weeks on end. And you made a lot of announcements to the people very, very often. And any stories stick to your mind? And is there anything you learned about the power of the office through what we now call command and control, which has now become the watchword of anti-terrorist policy? Anything you learned?
Stick-to-itiveness. I mean, the one thing you can do as governor is you can stick to something. You can keep coming back at the legislature and back at the legislature and back at the legislature. And I did that again and again on wetlands bills, particularly, where it'd be stopped by somebody, housing advocates, or somebody would stop the bill, and then I'd come back at them again. And eventually, if you come back, and if the public's on your side, eventually I think you can get some of the things through. That was one lesson. Another lesson on the environmental bills was that, well, it's part of the same lesson. You had to get public support. I mean, you had to go, because an environmental bill generally only has the public supporting it, because specialized interests in Trenton are generally on the other side. Because every environmental bill you pass, there are groups whose economic interests are hurt by it. So they're going to be on the other side. So you've got to get public support. I mean, you've got to go to editorial boards. You've got to get whatever you can to get people behind them. But it was, I remember, I'll tell you one brief story I learned. When we had we put about $750 million into a vast program to clean up the beaches after we had spills that were embarrassing to the state, waste washing up on the beach, needles from New York, a whole bunch of stuff. We put out $750 million in which we went after stormwater drainage. We went after stuff that was crumbling off the piers and the Hudson River and washing down the shore. We went after New York City and sued them and everything else. There's a whole bunch of things. And after we'd basically done the program, and we were convinced that the beaches were going to be better now because we'd put all this money and done all this work and done a program. I don't remember how many bills there were in it, but it was something like 10 or 11 bills to accomplish it all. We still had the problem that people had come down to the shore the summer before and had been confronted with garbage on the beaches and weren't planning to come back. And as you know, the tourist industry is perhaps the most important industry, one of them in the state of New Jersey. So the question was how to get the tourists back. So we were trying to figure out how to do it. And we were trying a lot of things. For instance, I remember figuring what we'd do if we got the leading scientists at Princeton and Rutgers. Because we did, I mean, we were the first state, and I think still are, maybe the only state, to actually have the waters tested every week now. And if a beach is not safe, we tell the public and we close it. So I mean, we did things like that, and nobody else was doing. So we thought we had it well done. The problem was nobody believed us. They do not believe politicians. So governor was not any good in that one. We tried to get leading scientists from Rutgers and from Princeton, and nobody seemed to believe them either. And we really were at a quandary. And so I called Jim Burke, who was then the president of Johnson & Johnson, who has got national recognition for the way he solved the Tylenol problem. And I said, you got any? I said, well, there's this firm I hired who will do focus groups and find out what works. So we got these focus groups, and we said, well, what if they found out that we've cleaned up all the storm waste? What if they found out we've stopped them? What if we found out we sued New York, and New York, what if we found out they're covering their garbage now? What if we found out, what if we did this and that? And everything we asked the tourist group, they said, well, now will you come back to the state? Nah, garbage, you know. And we're getting really frustrated. And toward the end, there was one little bill, I don't think it was an administration bill, I think it was some legislator's bill, I don't remember who it was. You may remember when I tell you what it was, but it was a bill that said, if you dump garbage off a boat, it's a criminal offense. You can go to jail. Now, in all the bills we had in the package to clean up waste, that was the one that would have done the least good. Not it wasn't a bad bill, but it would have done the least good as far as cleaning up the problems. But the final thing, they got to this bill after about 30 questions, and the final question was, this bill, if they dump off boats, you can go to jail for that. And everybody in the focus group stood up and said, jail? Well, they're serious then. And so they put me down on the beach in my best New Jersey and you outfit, and saying, we've got the most beautiful beaches here, and you all ought to come, and New Jersey and you perfect together. But if you think you're going to dump anything in the water off our beaches, then there was a picture of me in the Essex County Jail, which at that point was the worst jail, and I think slamming this old iron door shut and saying, you may end up in here. And they came back.
That's fun. That's great. I want to take the last 3 minutes or so and talk about the commission. This is obviously the part of your career in everybody's modern memory, recent memory. But let me start with the decision the president made to pick you as the chairman. Now, Slade Gordon says that you and Lee Hamilton are probably the most famous second choices in history. And he says it because Henry Kissinger had been named, and here was Mr. Everything, Mr. Foreign Policy, and blah, blah, blah. And they name a former governor who hadn't worked in Washington, hadn't done much in intelligence work and things of that kind. What went through your mind when the call came inviting you to serve as chairman?
Well, I felt like a ton of bricks had fallen on me. I mean, I'd pretty well avoided anything in Washington now, other than some small commissions over a number of years, and I'd been offered a number of things, and I turned them all down because I didn't want to go to Washington. And but I had, as many of you had, I'd lost good friends on 9/11, and had spoken at a number of funerals at that point, and you just, it wasn't the kind of thing you could say no to, but I felt like a ton of bricks had fallen on me, and I just. You thought of the enormity of that task, the emotion involved, the attack on the country, and while I said yes, I then started doing a lot of hard thinking, and my stomach started churning around as to what that meant. And it meant, you're starting from scratch, starting 2 months late because of George Mitchell had resigned as vice chairman and Henry Kissinger resigned as chairman. Starting with no staff, you had to hire the whole staff, starting with no office space, a budget that had been only stuck in the bill as a marker, so there was no real budget. And you had a timeline, which you had to get it all done. And I had, with the exception of Jim Thompson, who had been governors together in the 80s, nobody I knew. Nobody I knew in the commission. I mean, Democrats and Republicans that I had yet to meet, basically. And so I had an awful lot of thinking, and what I basically came to the conclusion on, by the way, was that looking at the other members of the commission, that they all knew much more than I did about all the subjects that we had to look at, because they'd been in Washington for a number of years. One of them, Fred Fielding, had been the chief counsel to the president. Jamie Gorelick had been deputy attorney general. John Lehman had been secretary of the Navy. I mean, these were very distinguished people, every one of them. I was the least distinguished, no one who knew the least about, and intelligence, intelligence, to look at intelligence and the failure of intelligence, one of our largest tasks. I knew nothing about intelligence. And yet Lee Hamilton had been chairman of the Intelligence Committee, Tim Romer had served on it, Slade Gordon had served on it, so the people who knew much more than I did. So I figured my role was to keep the thing together, to figure how we were going to conduct the investigation in a way that was different than other people had before, because most commission reports end up sitting on a shelf, and I recognize that. To be as open as possible, to set a proper conduit for the families, to conduct the investigation and the hiring of staff in such a way that we were going to put history first. It wasn't just going to be a government report. The people frankly had been recommended to me as chief of staff by the White House and others would not have done that, a different kind of person. And to try and, as best of my ability, keep the thing as bipartisan as possible. Because I knew there were two things that would kill our work. One was, and I said this in the first commission meeting, if there was any leak of any kind, it would give every federal agency, and especially the White House, the opportunity to say, you don't see anything else, and you've damaged national security already, no matter how mild the leak was. So any leak that came out would be catastrophic. And second thing was, if we started wrangling and it looked like Republicans on one side and Democrats on the other, they were going to say like everybody else in Washington, and we're going to lose our credibility. So the first time I sat down with Lee Hamilton, who was the vice chair, and we'd, I guess, shaken hands, but really didn't know each other. I said, Lee, as far as I'm concerned, you're not the vice chair, you're the chair. And I'm going to hire no staff without your approval. I'll make no decisions without your approval. I'm not going television. I'm not going to go on television, because at that point everybody was asking me to go on television, because you asked the chairman, to go on television. I said, I turned them all down. I don't accept any of them until you agree to come with me. And we're going to run this thing together. And that was probably the best decision I made all the way through, because Lee Hamilton is one tremendous human being. I mean, a real statesman, the kind of person you'd want to serve in Congress now if you had the opportunity to elect anybody. And I don't think we had a major disagreement from that day until we issued our report. And as long as Lee and I were together, the rest of them gradually came together behind us.
I want to wind up by asking you the same question I asked you when you finished with my class at the Kennedy School. After 20 months of intensive hearings, demands for documents, threats of subpoenas, I think we issued 3 eventually. We finally got access to the President of the United States, and you and your 9 colleagues are now in the Oval Office with the President. And you said you looked out the window and you got this, what you called your wow moment. Would you tell us what your wow moment was, please?
Yeah, this was in the whole business, and we'd been demanding, really, to interview the president and been turned down for a year because we had to interview both Clinton and Bush so we could tell the public what they knew and when they knew it. Because there are all sorts of rumors out there that they had information ahead of time, maybe planes running into buildings, maybe terrorists, something, that they had secret briefings and all of that that the public didn't know about. And so we had to talk to the president and ask him those questions to clear up all the questions. And then we got the whole commission in. Congress gets to see the president, usually just the chairman and the vice chairman. When his documents they see, usually just the chairman and the vice chairman of the committee, when it's secret documents. We got the whole commission in to see, and I was sitting there, 10 unelected citizens, sitting there in the Oval Office with the president. And I was right. I looked out the window and I thought, my God, this democracy works. I really did. I thought nowhere else in the world would we be allowed to ask any question we want to of the President of the United States, the leader of any country, 10 citizens. It just wouldn't happen if you think about it in any other country in the world. And I thought, this is good. We'll be all right.
I want to thank the governor on that note and the audience.
There's nothing I can add except to say this is good. This is good. It makes me feel proud and grateful. You know, people make jokes about New Jersey all the time, but you look up here at the talent and the leadership and in the room, and it's just a good feeling. So thank you all for being here. I recommend the book very highly. The book is for sale if you would like. If you want to grab these signatures, you still have an opportunity. And we thank you again for being here. Have a good summer.